There's no shortage of problems in the video game industry. Take your pick. We got workplace abuse, alleged charity fraud, run-of-the-mill corporate malarkey, sexual misconduct. That one seems to be happening a lot, actually. And why just the other week, a guy was exposed for faking the existence of a prominent accessibility advocate. Twice. And the video game journalists that cover these stories have been in their fair share of the excitement. Unethical quid pro quo, culture wars, trying to blackmail a man with his own homemade erotica. It doesn't happen that often, but enough times to question the legitimacy of the entire affair. And when trust of the game's press goes away, the demagogues come out to play. These are people who take advantage of the chaos to cause problems for profit and sell solutions. And it's hard to get rid of them because first you have to educate people on how we got here in the first place, and then you have to convince people it's important. But I'll give it a go. Because I believe gamers, developers, and journalists should be informed of Nick Calandra's unsavory behavior. I'm going to take a casual stroll through history first, but if you're just looking for the trouble, feel free to skip ahead to the time shown. Pretend YouTube existed in the 1890s. New York World and New York Journal were butting heads and competing to be the biggest daily news channel of their time. There were two problems, though. Firstly, reporting on major events accurately is a slow process. Major events don't happen every day, and when they do happen, most of your time spent fact-checking and trying to find people who are willing to speak to you and verify claims and evidence. Which means you then have to find more people to verify their claims and their evidence. But once you do all that, the write-up goes by pretty quickly. The second problem was that objective journalism, where you report on facts and try to stay as neutral as possible, free of opinions, is boring content. Save that for the weather. So the owner of New York World, Joseph Pulitzer, sped up the process by simply not fact-checking as much and ran this channel in New York as he did his old channel in St. Louis, after he was forced to relocate because his angry style of news led to a man being shot and killed inside of his reporter's studio. Sensationalized headlines, stories of corruption that weren't always true, political rhetoric, and big, scary pictures to bait people's attention. Yes, that is the same Pulitzer that the Pulitzer Prize is named after, the very award given to people for exceptional achievements in journalism, that Pulitzer. And he had a rival, the owner of the New York Journal, William Randolph Hearst. Now, Hearst wasn't going to let reporting the slow as molasses truth get in the way of him having the biggest daily news channel at the time. So a circulation war began between the two where each one tried to outrage bait the other. This inflammatory style, dubbed journalism of action by Hearst, became more popular among the New York working class and featured big, bad, scary headlines in bold print, often exaggerated stories to make minor news look like major news, scary pictures or made-up drawings, fake interviews, misleading headlines, pseudoscience. His side was always the underdog fighting against the system. And he also sensationalized corruption, sometimes made up, all to boost views. To everyone else, Pulitzer and Hearst's style of reporting was known as the yellow press or yellow journalism, due to both their channels featuring the Yellow Kid comic drawn by Richard F. Outcault, and it was their rivalry that fueled civil unrest before, during, and after the Spanish-American War. They didn't start America's xenophobia and all their other political fears, they merely fed into the fear-mongering to profit from it. In 1898, both Pulitzer and Hearst continued fighting for views and played a blame game with Spain, printing false claims that Spain blew up the USS Maine. The popularity of their respective channels skyrocketed, and they raised the price of their content and kept them raised after the war was over, which ate into the profits of the newsboys that sold their papers on the streets of New York, which led to the Newsboys' Strike of 1899. Important to point out, because for as much as Hearst claimed to stand for the working class, he only did so because they were his paying customers. The middle class didn't care for his brand of yellow journalism, but Hearst figured he could get around that by using his newspapers to sway public opinion, to leverage money, and seats in political office. William Randolph Hearst was a demagogue. Demagogue usually refers to a politician, but it can refer to any person that gains considerable influence by falsely playing to the hopes and fears of the common man for their own selfish gains. They say they're looking out for the people, but their actions show they're willing to say anything and play any side. In the early 1900s, Hearst found himself running for office multiple times with and against the Tammany Hall political machine, known for their social reform, as well as their corrupt political strategies such as embezzlement, cronyism, and racketeering. Hearst frequently used his channel to express his anti-Chinese and anti-Asian and anti-non-European views. Then he expanded his bigotry to include the British Empire during World War I and encouraged putting Japanese Americans in internment camps during World War II. He was anti-prohibition, but used his influence to push the presidential campaign of Herbert Hoover in 1928, because Hearst held an everlasting grudge against Al Smith, who vetoed Hearst's final attempt to run for office. Anti-prohibition beaten out by pro-pettiness. In the 1930s, Hearst was against big government and claimed FDR was a commie who would take away the rights of the working class, until FDR chose Hearst's choice of running mate, John Garner, instead of Al Smith. But Hearst changed his tune again and went against the working class when FDR implemented unemployment relief through the New Deal program. Suddenly, Hearst's channel started supporting big business and fought against higher income tax laws. Furthermore, in the 30s, Hearst used his channel to vilify Mexicans and their devil drug, the marijuana, pushing for the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. When in actuality, he was pissed that Mexican revolutionary Pancho Villa appropriated about 60,000 of his cattle, and Hearst didn't want cheaper and more renewable hemp to compete with his lumber holdings. Plus, Hearst was competing with other publications at the time to provide the hottest faked footage of the Mexican Revolution. This guy was all over the place, like the shadow version of Forrest Gump. In the late 1930s, Hearst only allowed for positive coverage of the Nazis, who were paying 10 times above the standard subscription rate for his international news service, and Hearst fired any reporter under his employment who dared criticize German fascism. Not to mention, he paid the likes of Hitler, Göring, and Mussolini on average $1,500, that's about $30,000 today, to write their own propaganda for his channel, which he aired uncritically. That is until a little event called Kristallnacht in 1938, informally known as the beginning of the Holocaust. Suddenly, Hearst was wagging his finger at Hitler on his channel. The entire civilized world is shocked and shamed by Germany's brutal oppression of the Jewish people. You, Hitler, are making the flag of National Socialism a symbol of national savagery. Yeah, shocking to the man who was essentially running Hitler's PR. Hearst self-servingly flip-flopped his entire life until it was over in 1951. Despite many public and political attempts to stop him from gaining any influence even as far back as 50 years prior, when he and his rage-baiting channel were blamed for the assassination of President William McKinley in 1901. It was when he was running for office in 1906 that he was called out by President Theodore Roosevelt's Secretary of State for being a demagogue, promoting his own selfish interests while claiming it was in the best interest of the people, publishing multiple editorials slandering other politicians, including the late president, and publishing editorials alluding to political assassinations mere months before the president was shot. Because unfortunately, people like Hearst, demagogue grifters with no moral standing, willing to say anything and everything to get their way, don't just go away with reason and logic, because they're supported by ideologues. That's someone who has strong beliefs and opinions, and is unwilling to budge from them even when cold hard evidence suggests they might be wrong. Or as the author Jonathan Swift put it, it is useless to attempt to reason a man out of a thing he was never reasoned into. If your beliefs aren't held up by logic, then logic's not going to knock them down. That's not to say that all emotion-based opinions are wrong, but a better way to counter a false rage-inducing style of reporting was with a factual rage-inducing style of reporting that was around in the 1830s, later popularized by Nellie Bly when she went undercover to expose the awful conditions of a mental institution, and eventually became more common at the start of the 1900s during the Progressive era. It was a new kind of investigative journalism. On the surface, muckraking journalism looked just like yellow journalism. Big scary titles, tales of corruption, and politically charged stances, all for the interest of the common man. But with one big difference. This time around, it was real. Witnesses and evidence were being validated, corroborated. Oftentimes the muckrakers themselves were the ones going undercover to find the information. Some people may not like journalists being so involved in the stories they report as they feel it creates a biased narrative. But to others, this boots-on-the-ground style of writing gave it more credibility, as the reporters were no longer saying, "Someone said something happened and somewhere saint somewhere." They were now saying, "I saw with my own eyes and heard with my own ears because I was there." This made muckraking more enticing for the working class that had grown fond of something spicier than unbiased, unseasoned objectivity. And it focused their attention on the real problems at large, which led to them calling out for better legislation and ethical standards. Tweet Days in St. Louis by Lincoln Stevens helped root out political corruption in St. Louis. Ida Tarbell's The Rise of the Standard Oil Company and the History of the Standard Oil Company exposed Rockefeller's unsavory business practices and led to the breakup of his monopoly. The Great American Fraud by Samuel Hopkins Adams exposed pharmaceutical companies price gouging and falsely advertising their drugs as more potent than they really were. His work, alongside Upton Sinclair's undercover investigation of Chicago meatpacking plants, were what influenced the creation of the Pure Food and Drug Act and Meat Inspection Act of 1906. David Graham Phillips' The Treason of the Senate exposed corruption in the U.S. Senate and led to the creation of the 17th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. What I'm getting at here is while the government is the pen that writes laws and regulations, the people of the country are the hand that holds it, and information is what moves the hand of the people. It was difficult at times for the Muckrakers to be taken seriously because their stories so closely resembled the fake yellow journalism people were accustomed to. President Roosevelt himself called the socialist Sinclair a crackpot and said, "I have an utter contempt for him. He is hysterical, unbalanced, and untruthful." 3/4 of the things he said were absolute falsehoods. For some of the remainder, there was only a basis of truth. Until he read The Jungle, changed his mind, and ordered an investigation into the Chicago meatpacking facilities. Radical action must be taken to do away with the efforts of arrogant and selfish greed on the part of the capitalist. Muckrakers had to overcome politicians, public perception, and even the American press itself. Sinclair was able to leverage his near-celebrity status and public reputation to get around press moguls like William Randolph Hearst, who constantly tried to stifle honest journalism. To that end, Upton Sinclair released his most dangerous piece of writing, The Brass Check, in 1919, an expose uncovering corrupt business practices in mass media. The title alluded to the way in which demagogues like Hearst paid for the lip service of journalists as one would in a brothel. The book included Sinclair's personal anecdotes and the experiences of multiple well-respected writers at the time, with one James H. Barrie describing the Associated Press as the damnedest, meanest monopoly on the face of the earth, the wet nurse for all other monopolies. It lies by day, it lies by night, and it lies for the very lust of lying. Its news gatherers, I sincerely believe, only obey orders. Sinclair challenged any news publication who could disprove a single claim of his to sue him for criminal libel. The Associated Press took up the challenge and announced an investigation to refute Sinclair's book and take him to court. The investigation never got anywhere, and he was never taken to court. Instead, they chose to ignore him. Unfortunately, Sinclair wasn't big enough to overcome the combined cold shoulder of 41 large newspaper corporations denying him mainstream circulation and claiming it was a made-up story used to spook little socialists if they were misbehaving. One good thing did come through, though. His book influenced the creation of the first American Code of Ethics for journalists in 1923. Ethics are essentially the rules and values that guide people who work in a specific business or occupation. Violating ethical standards isn't always illegal, nor is it always intentional. In fact, being unfit for duty can be considered unethical and be enough to revoke your work privileges as, say, a doctor or a lawyer. Example here is Jack Thompson, the former lawyer who famously tried to sue rap music, video games, and Howard Stern for being too crass. He was permanently disbarred by the Supreme Court of Florida in 2008 for inappropriate conduct and making false claims. In the case of journalists, members of the Society of Professional Journalists believe that public enlightenment is the forerunner of justice and the foundation of democracy. Ethical journalism strives to ensure the free exchange of information that is accurate, fair, and thorough. An ethical journalist acts with integrity. The Society declares these 4 principles as the foundation of ethical journalism and encourages their use in its practice by all people in all media. Seek truth and report it. Minimize harm. Act independently. Be accountable and transparent. There's a plethora of elucidations holding up these 4. And all of them combine to act as the base that keeps journalism stable, but also as the compass meant to guide the press as it continues to evolve. Unfortunately, these are self-policing regulations. If a journalist or press CEO was being unintentionally unethical, publishing fake news, they'd need to be held accountable by their outlet, other outlets, their boss, their coworkers, and ultimately their audience. If someone's being intentionally unethical, then odds are they aren't the only ones doing it. And they've surrounded themselves with people that condone loose ethics, or they keep people around that couldn't or wouldn't know how to hold them accountable. Rarely are the problems concentrated in one specific spot or one specific person. If there's a problem with a specific press outlet, it usually means that there's systemic failures on multiple levels. Fast forward to the 2010s, where traditional, objective, boring journalism was fighting for its life to stand out among the saucier news variants. Tabloid journalism with no respect for boundaries. Gonzo journalism, where the writer immerses themselves in the issues while abusing their liver. Literary journalism that takes the long, winding, scenic route. As if any of these could compete for viewership against the 24-hour television news cycle and the ramping up of the internet craze. There were no real rules. The lines between information and entertainment continued to blur and provided the perfect cover for demagogues to profit from misinformation. Before his short-lived political career ended in his arrest on federal charges of conspiracy to commit mail fraud and money laundering in 2020, Steve Bannon was a business and entertainment guy. Most notably, he worked at Goldman Sachs, one of the largest investment banks in the world, and in 2005 he convinced them to invest $60 million in funding for internet gaming entertainment. This was a company based in Hong Kong that offered low wages for people to play World of Warcraft and grind for in-game gold. IGE would then sell the virtual currency and virtual items back to the other players for real money, amounting to more than $250 million in sales per year. However, a lot of gamers felt gold farmers ruined the fun and economy, so they took their complaints to the publisher of the game, Blizzard Entertainment, and lashed out at IGE. Blizzard took their request seriously and systematically banned thousands of accounts linked to gold farming in 2006, which cost IGE $200,000 every month. In 2007, IGE was losing $500,000 a month and was on the receiving end of an impending class action lawsuit opened up by an Antonio Hernandez on behalf of other gamers. The lawsuit didn't get as far as sinking the IGE ship, and ultimately gamers got what they wanted: the freedom to enjoy the game they paid for without someone else ruining the economy. This entire affair cost Steve Bannon millions of dollars, but his eyes were now open to these, as he put it, rootless white males who had monster power. It can be asserted that Bannon was referring to the internet trolls, online activists, and anyone who tried to take down IGE with a high degree of internet savvy and ability to operate unseen, but he believed that these sorts of gamers in general could be harnessed and used to sway culture and then politics, all for profit. His problem was that gamers, for the most part, didn't care about politics, and back in 2007, politics didn't really care about gamers. But remember, if you can sway information, then you can use that to sway people. And sway the information he did after he took over Breitbart News in 2012 and pushed its far-right ideology into alt-right nationalist territory. I can't say whether he actually believed what he was spewing, but Ben Shapiro, well-known conservative political commentator and former editor-at-large, had this to say when he resigned from Breitbart in 2016. Steve Bannon is a bully and has sold out the late Breitbart.com founder Andrew Breitbart's mission in order to back another bully, Donald Trump. He has shaped the company into Trump's personal Pravda. He later said, "I have no evidence that Steve's an anti-Semite. I think Steve's a very, very power-hungry dude who's willing to use anybody and anything in order to get ahead, and that includes making common cause with the racist, anti-Semitic alt-right." In 2017, Bannon declared war on the traditional conservative members of the GOP, such as Mitch McConnell, if they didn't fall in line with the rising MAGA ideology. In 2018, Bannon said the Democrats don't matter, the real opposition is the media, and the way to deal with them is to flood the zone with shit. He's a demagogue. He's a grifter. His goals are clear: take the people's ability to be informed, shape the narrative, then shape the culture, and profit. For that, he needed gamers, and for that, he recruited a man he himself described as an amoral nihilist to activate the army of gamers and online trolls. Simplified, Milo Yiannopoulos was a professional provocateur. He liked to say and write things that pissed people off, got paid to do so, and Steve Bannon saw him as the bridge he needed to get to the gamers. Milo gained significant popularity by hijacking the Gamergate controversy of 2014. Some say it started as a call-out of unethical behavior from games journalists, like taking bribes, firing people who gave low review scores, or that people all over the political spectrum and the apolitical were growing tired of insufferable virtue signaling overlaying the real social issues of the time. Regardless of its inception, by the time Milo made himself the face of Gamergate, it had turned into a harassment campaign against women and feminists who, according to him, were fake gamers ruining video games with their politics for money. Meanwhile, Milo was a fake gamer and trying to insert his own politics into video games for money. Sure, he called himself a classic liberal and a cultural libertarian, but he also was sued in 2013 for not paying his own staff. In 2014, he blamed video games as the cause of Elliot Rodger's killing spree, describing him as an archetypal beta male, insecure, socially awkward, and obsessed with the fantasy worlds of video games and science fiction movies. And concluding, if there's a cultural milieu that contributed to the creation of Elliot Rodger, it was that of nihilistic video games. A few months later, he said Grand Theft Auto felt like a game for frustrated beta males who can't kill or shag anything in real life, so get their kicks doing it on a computer screen. What's notable is that he painted gamers as a more disgusting and vile breed of people than the articles other outlets would later write on the topic of "gamers are over," in retaliation to the harassment spawned through Gamergate. But then a few weeks later, he was writing about the lack of ethics and accountability in games journalism, which was a problem other prominent figures had pointed out, but Milo was also targeting women and feminists. All before he's played a single video game. A year later, he makes a big hullabaloo about how he got the noble gamers wrong and how gaming changed his perspective while giving vague descriptions of the few games he did play. Don't take this as a proper source, but if this 9-year-old Reddit comment holds true, then Milo played about 30 hours of video games in 300 days. And yet he praised or disparaged 10 different games in this article. XCOM he praised, but admitted to only playing 11 minutes. Dragon Age Inquisition was criticized for shoving politics in your face, but it takes over 40 hours to finish. Meanwhile, BioShock, a blatantly political game, was praised. And to top it all off, Milo was given gifts and an in-game character in Postal 2, which he brought up in multiple articles but only disclosed once. I'm not a game gatekeeper, but it sounds like the people on Milo's side were backing a fake gamer, not finishing games before giving an opinion, overtly political framing, and taking favors from studios. Are these things wrong? Are they right? The problem was that there was no consistency from Milo or the gamers that claimed to be standing up for ethics, saying these things were wrong, but doing it themselves. It seemed more like an enemy of my enemy is my friend situation, and Milo was hurting the right people until he wasn't. His behavior grew more inflammatory and irrational, leading him to feud with Ben Shapiro, who rightfully pointed out Milo's stance as a mashup of nationalism without constitutionalism, vileness masquerading as political incorrectness, and frustration at the status quo misdirected to support a corrupt insider. All of it channeled into a frightening cult of personality. It's easy for Milo to do it because Milo is making his money off of being a provocateur. His stances grew more extreme and divisive, wishing death on journalists and giving bizarre interviews where he seemingly condoned pedophilia on multiple occasions. He scorned the left to join the right. He swore vengeance against the right and Trumpism. Milo ran out of allies. But the ideologues didn't go away. The people who hold beliefs so strongly that you can't change their mind with factual evidence.
Just telling the facts are no longer enough. You now have to be persuasive and charismatic and interesting and funny. Just telling people things isn't enough anymore.
Validation, anger, happiness, hope, ignorance, fear, social connections, how much someone else likes an online personality. These are all factors that can outweigh consistency or truth. And these kinds of people are loyal to a fault, giving you their time and their money. They'll stand up for you so long as you parrot their ideas back to them and reaffirm their belief system. If you present ideas that go against their convictions, then many of them will abandon you and a small subsection will attack you. How ludicrous is it? You can make an extra $10,000 a year on the side off of YouTube alone, $30,000 minimum if you put more effort in. I hear you can make up to $100,000 per video for spouting Russian propaganda. That might sound enticing as a part-time gig or a full-time gig. It's got low requirements. All you have to do is hate the right people and pretend you're doing it for the gamers. And there's never been more people to hate and more gamers to appeal to than in 2024, when the video game industry is estimated to be worth over $200 billion globally, bigger than all the other forms of entertainment combined. There's a paradox. It's difficult to fix the problems in the entertainment industry because people are too distracted by the entertainment industry. You're here to unwind and escape from your problems, not hear about more problems, which makes it so the issues grow until they're too big for a general audience to ignore. And even then, all they see are surface-level problems. Game delays, cancellations, and shoddy quality. At worst, predatory monetization tactics. They don't see the issues underneath. Aggressive buyouts, underpaying and overworking, layoffs, studio shutdowns, wage theft, sexual harassment. And they can't be called out by games journalists because they are also going through aggressive buyouts, layoffs, studio shutdowns, overworking and underpaying or outright wage theft, and of course harassment by corporate or peers or gamers. I don't believe the gaming industry and its associated press are rotten to the core. Rather, there are too many issues to tackle spread out across different levels, and it's easy to hide it all under the vile veil of politics from demagogues. Personally, I think that's why a lot of the influence when it comes to news coverage and opinion pieces has been going the way of YouTubers. There's a demand for independence and accountability, but with a bit of pizzazz and personality to counter the grifters at every turn. I think their willingness to rake the muck in front of the public eye is important and helps clean the grime at the lower ends, where you don't see traditional justice. Going to the police and going to court eats up a lot of time and money, and ultimately it's not about what happened, it's about what you can prove. So most people would rather take whatever evidence they have and put their reputation on the line in front of the court of public opinion. That's the process I went through in 2019 and 2020. I played Smite and I worked to get rid of a social predator known for blackballing content creators as well as being a sexual predator. In 2021, I got rid of another blackballer who was also a stream scammer. And now in 2024, I'm stepping up to the plate once more to bring Nick Calandra to the light, who for the past 6 years has engaged in rather unscrupulous behavior that takes advantage of consumers, workers, games journalists, and developers for his own benefit. I worked alongside him for 2 of those years, and a lot of this wasn't made known to me until after I resigned and people stepped forward. 14 people reached out to me with claims and evidence. Anything I show or mention is my personal experience or someone else's that I verified with at least 2 other sources. Most of them wish to stay anonymous, and ethically speaking, I don't have to reveal them or show any evidence. That's an unrealistic expectation that's stuck to YouTube muckraking. But I also understand that I don't have the reputation currently to say, "Trust me, bro." A lot is censored, happen in calls, or in Slack messages I don't have access to. But I will show what I can where I can. On the worker side of things, number 1, Nick overworks and underpays employees while promising them better wages or promotions for months or years at a time. Number 2, meanwhile, he takes credit for their ideas and their work and uses that to leverage his own raises and a bigger budget so he can shoot documentaries and go to gaming events. Point 3, if you ask Nick about the money he owes you or the promotions he promised you, he'll dodge it and blame corporate. Number 4, when corporate asks Nick why they're losing money because his projects aren't profitable, Nick blames the workers, calling them untalented and lazy. Point 5, if a worker tries to stand up to Nick while working with him, then he isolates them or tries to sabotage them. And point 6, when that worker leaves, then Nick disparages them or tries to use his connections behind the scenes to ruin their career. And here's the timeline to illustrate a consistent history of this behavior. While at Gamumentary, Nick routinely promised financial compensation to his volunteers. Sometimes his staff had to pay for expenses out of their own pocket. On screen, you'll see 2 examples. One's a $249 flight receipt for a documentary shoot, and the other's a $250 receipt for documentary music. You'll also see here on the screen an example of a staff member asking for a contract in 2017 for whatever it is that this is. And Nick rejected the idea. It's a volunteer basis still, not really sure what kind of contract I'd need to write. I don't think we need a contract written to say that we're civil to each other. The way I look at it is that we both want to be doing this, and if you don't, then you don't, I guess. So someone asked for a formal safety net and Nick turned it down. Then in 2018, Nick sold the site and got himself a job with Enthusiast Gaming, leaving the rest of the team high and dry. He justified it by saying he felt they had no financial stake in the site, and it was his name on the official documents for the site. Even though the sale wouldn't have been possible without the work of the rest of the staff and them covering expenses at times. 4 of them had a meeting with Nick to convince him to be more communicative. They were fine with him having final say, they just wanted to at least be clued in on the decisions. Nick repeatedly refused, so the 4 resigned. And when they asked how much their work was worth, he refused to tell them.
What it just comes down to is it feels like you are mulling these decisions over and you're thinking them through and then making that decision. And even though you think you are taking our best interest in mind, and even if you are actually doing the correct decision and actually taking our interest in mind, that does not mean you can do these things without involving us in them. Because by involving us in them, I mean having the discussion, being open and honest with us, and having voting rights to say, hey, do we want to do this? Because at the end of the day, even if it is the right decision you make and you do a perfect deal, if we're not involved in it, it's going to feel like we're left out. It's going to feel like you are the puppet master and we dance to your strings.
Well, I'm sorry, if you don't have financial stake in the site, like it's just, there's not going to be a voting right on those decisions.
I do have a financial stake in the site because you've been promising me ad revenue and money, etc. for a year. I don't care about it, but the fact that I have put in a year's worth of work, even though that has not translated to a check or dollars in my pocket yet, does mean I have a stake in the website. And for you to say otherwise that's insulting.
Do you have like emails, like back and forths with them discussing anything as regards to numbers?
Yep.
Why weren't we CC'd?
Because you are not paying the taxes on the site. You are not paying for the hosting on the site. Like, I'm completely aware. I'm not saying you don't have a stake in the site. You've worked on the documentaries and all that, and I totally plan to compensate you guys for that. But those are not the financial dealings of the site are mine and mine alone.
I think that's what we disagree with.
You can't. Literally, my name is on the domain name. I pay the bills.
That's fine. We're not saying that necessarily.
I pay the taxes on the site.
It's that for morale to improve across the team, that cannot go forward. In order for us to feel like a team and not peasants in a kingdom, that process has to change.
The financial, that's not the business dealings of the site. The financials of the site are with me.
I think it's time for us to kind of come to a point in a way. I'm going to speak for myself here. There were things that I was hoping to get out of this meeting in terms of changes, agreed upon changes that we kind of went through, etc. And Nick, the truth is I don't feel like there is enough change coming from you in terms of actually wanting to make the site better and own up to mistakes that have been made by you or by others or by all of us. And quite frankly, at this point, I'm out of the website. I don't want to be part of this anymore if my effort and my work for more than a year, more than 30 plus pieces of content is not going to be appreciated. And
serious,
that there's not going to be any changes going forward.
I ran OSP for 4 years, and people did a hell of a lot more work for me than you've done.
Okay, let's stop insulting people.
I encourage the others to speak up as well. You're not showing enough willingness to actually do change for the better of the website and to include us in these things and to actually improve the processes. And to respect the members as volunteers. And
including people in is the financial decisions of the site. We literally just went over how the content has been streamlined and that things have changed. So you're grasping at straws here at this point.
I encourage others to speak up if they feel the same way.
I mean, I would argue that there's a quantifiable dollar amount that we could say for, hours that have been worked on documentaries or on shoots or whatever. Like, I'm not even saying that I expect compensation for all of that, but I think it is. I don't think it's unreasonable to say that we do, at some level, have a financial stake. Sure, we're not paying the taxes. Sure, we're not paying the domain fees, but we have put in, hundreds of hours cumulatively to create these things that have brought us to this point. And I think that's all we're saying is it. I don't want to sugarcoat it, but there is a little bit of a slap in the face element of, we have all worked really hard to create these things because we really believe in the brand. And even when presented with, sure, this sounds like a really great opportunity, but when it comes down to it, you're the only one who's protected by it. And it's just very difficult for us morale-wise to look at that and you say you have our best interests at heart, and I think you do, but I think there's more steps that could be taken to really, protect our best interests. And I think that's where all of us are frustrated, is just that as great as this opportunity seems, there's this dark cloud hanging over it because none of us are really sure how it's going to play out, once the actual I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, because you're the only one who's had communication with enthusiasts, and none of us know them.
The website isn't even worth $1,000.
Sorry to interrupt. Real quick fact check there. He says the site was not worth even $1,000, and you will now see on your screen, August 14, 2024, he said he sold the site for $2,000 in cash and $2,500 in stock. There's also an email from November 18, 2021, where he states that he sold Gamumentary for $8,500. As you were.
One last question, just kind of a shot in the dark here. How much is Enthusiast paying for Gamumentary and the site as a whole?
Not telling you that.
Okay.
While at Escapist, that's 2018 to 2022, Nick promised better wages, part-time contracts, and full-time contracts. He took credit for his workers' ideas and presented them as his own to try and secure a bigger salary for himself. He'd overwork people to try and meet the absurd goals he promised his bosses. When workers asked about pay, he dodged the question and blamed his bosses, saying they were out of touch and greedy. When Nick's bosses questioned him about the rising costs and lack of results, Nick blamed the workers, saying they were lazy and lacked talent. On the screen, you'll see an example of an email from August 2020 where Nick is setting the terms for a position as a creative director and a salary of $100,000. Another example, here's an email from December 2020 where he outlines the role in greater detail and lowers the asking salary to $90,000. On September 9, 2022, Nick's official role was editor-in-chief with a base salary of $87,550. He bargained once again for another raise and received a bump to $96,305 on April 16, 2023. He asked that his editor-in-chief responsibilities be changed so he could take on the role of creative director, which was formalized on July 10, 2023. So he prioritizes himself. Meanwhile, Here's an example from 2018 of Nick quietly parting ways with a worker that he himself says he had no issues with, but behind the scenes he was doing it at the request of another editor-in-chief at a different publication. This person never received compensation for his work, which included filming interviews during PAX, and when pressed on it, Nick never responded. Here's an example of an email from May 2019, where Nick claims the community manager isn't doing their job. Not sure where we're justifying the price. This was to try and get them fired to give Omar, Nick's guy, a full-time contract. The community manager resigned August 2019. Later in 2020, Nick publicly asserts the community manager was over-moderating, contradicting his reason for trying to fire the guy in the first place. I'm not as strict as you probably think. We're pretty lenient on the website, let's put it this way. I'm the opposite of how the community manager was managing the forums. The first team that was brought in while the community manager was roughing you all up here is gone too. So he actively undermines his own workers, and he blames his bosses as well. Here's an example from December 2019 where Nick is faulting the parent company for the low pay and work conditions to a person handing in their resignation. Now here's an example of the type of game plan that Nick presents to his bosses to try and get his raises. This one specifically was presented to the Escapist in fall of 2023. When asked about them internally, he refers to them as actual realistic goals and such for 2024 for revenue targets that I set, so feeling better about all that. Firstly, there's a lot of other people's ideas thrown in here that he held back for months. Secondly, he blamed corporate for pushing unrealistic expectations on him, when in reality, Nick was peddling unrealistic results for raises. Multiple former coworkers of Nick have corroborated that that is how he operates. He overpromises with these ambiguous plans and abstract goals, gets what he wants, underdelivers, and then plays victim when it's time to be held accountable. For my time at Escapist, Nick did have me work multiple projects without compensation, promising to find a way to pay me later. He didn't. He also promised me a full-time contract for months while actively holding me back from it behind my back until it was eventually given to me against his wishes. When I pressed him on how much work I was being asked to do, he blamed his bosses and played the sympathy card, but he was the one pushing for it behind the scenes. For one example, you can see on this document that I was assigned to be the narrator for the Prima videos. That was not supposed to happen, and Nick told me it wasn't gonna happen. He offers people up, and then later coerces them through sympathy or promises. He consistently blamed the other workers for the position we were in, saying they didn't have the talent or work ethic to be profitable. He blamed corporate as well, saying they were greedy and out of touch. Now, while at Second Wind Group, he repeatedly promised our head of sales better pay. He held him back from fulfilling his duties. Then he stole credit for his work, which got him fired. Here's an example of Nick praising the head of sales. Now here's an example of a spreadsheet that was used to track who was bringing in what deals. The head of sales was overwhelmingly responsible for our sponsor revenue, our second biggest source of revenue. His behavior has only gotten worse as he's running out of people to blame. To wrap up this section, I will also add that Nick has a habit of getting in the way of people's work and trying to ruin their future prospects. Here's an example from 2017 where he's talking about a staffer that wasn't happy with Nick operating under the table. They're trying too hard to call us out on ethics. I can pretty much make sure that they don't ever work in games journalism again. Here's an example where he publicly claimed he had direct experience being dogpiled, attacked, belittled by the very same people that pretend to be the good guy, like his former editor-in-chief and the community manager he tried to fire. Recently, another coworker resigned, citing Nick as the problem. From repeated silo conversations, pitches that fell on deaf ears, then repurposed as original, and repeated frustrations, one-sided conversations that required me to reach out to some of y'all individually. He stated 5 years of this behavior. I also witnessed and received this treatment from Nick while at Escapist and SWG. He isolated me from the rest of the team, took credit for some of my ideas, and consistently tries to undermine me by saying I chase trends, infinite growth, algorithms, and SEOs, which if you're not in the industry is like saying that a plumber can't plumb. You're effectively calling someone a fraud in this field. Even though you can see in this example that Nick outlined an angle specifically for SEO purposes and spoke to the algorithm and made an entire channel for SEO chasing. Whether he believes this stuff is bad or not doesn't matter. He knows these words piss off the gamer audience and makes it harder to find work later. He'll say and step on whoever to get ahead. On the developer side, Nick projects a pro-developer attitude. He looks out for the people that makes the games. He says he fights for them to have better working conditions, more freedom, and more exposure, especially the smaller and low-budget indie developers. But behind the scenes, he weaponizes his developer connections against people to damage their future prospects. That is why most of my sources have to stay anonymous. Here's an example of a tweet from July 2024 stating, "I'm an activist for game developers to make what they want and not be abused by corporations. I'm an activist for good games media and got fired for pushing for it every day. I'm an activist for pushing for good in the industry and uplifting creative people in it. The only thing these channels are activists for is putting money in their pockets." Really, what he likes is the influence that comes with being connected to notable people in the industry. He is a bully and has tried to weaponize that influence multiple times over the years. I'm once again showing the example from 2017 where he states a staff member is trying too hard to call them out on ethics. Not a good plan when I have an extremely good rapport with developers. I can pretty much make sure that they don't ever work in games journalism again. Nick expressed similar thoughts like this towards others while I worked with him at Escapist. I didn't think anything of it at the time because frankly I thought he was being a braggart and had an overblown sense of his importance. While at SWG, it's a little odd to explain. At times, Nick influenced the group to reject sponsorship deals with smaller developers so that those developers felt there was a problem with their game. So then Nick could try to sell them a consultation or a promotion on the side for his own personal gain. I'll go into more detail. We offer sponsorship packages. This is where developers pay us money and we show off their games to our audience. Here's one example. At Tier 4, you pay us $6,000 and we'll play an ad for your game 7 times on live streams, 3 times before and during podcasts, 5 times during the middle of a video, and 3 social media posts. There's also smaller tiers. In this example, you pay us $750 and we play an ad 2 times before a live stream, 1 time before a podcast, and 1 social media post. And you can bargain for custom plans to bring the price down a bit, but at a certain point it's not worth it for a business owned by 13 people. Even $750 split 13 ways is $57 each, or in the grand scheme of all the other costs, it's not worth the effort. What Nick did is he swayed the group to not take the smaller deals, saying the game didn't look good or they were asking for too much and not willing to pay enough. Nick would then try to have the head of sales redirect those developers to him so Nick could try and sell personal consultations, personal promotions, or point them to a publisher to grow his own connections. He tried explaining the process to the group and said we were leaving money on the table if we didn't operate this way. The group didn't like the idea. Nick said he'd do it on his own then, justifying it as something he could do because he didn't get the raise that he wanted. To wrap up this section, Nick holds a general disdain for smaller, inexperienced developers that reach out to him too many times for his liking. Example here is a message from June that I sent to a coworker where Nick turns down a young developer because that guy has been in my feed for like a year trying to push his game onto me. I know he wants coverage, but that's basically spam to me at this point and I don't want to reward it. For context, Nick sets himself as the main point of contact for the group in most matters. Developers have to go to him, so spam to a degree is expected. But here's the spam he's referring to. August 2, 2022, Nick puts out a form for indie developers to submit their games for the Escapist Indie Showcase. ZoroArts submits his game. September 8, 2022, Nick talks about indie games. ZoroArts brings up his indie game. December 29, 2023, Nick talks about Metroidvanias. ZoroArts brings up his game, a Metroidvania. June 7, 2024, Nick uses the Pitch a Game hashtag, which is when you signal to developers to pitch you their games. ZoroArts pitches a different game. So the spam that Nick is refusing to reward is this developer brought up 2 different games in the span of 2 years, twice at Nick's behest when Nick used the Pitch a Game hashtag and when Nick was running an indie game showcase, which by the way has featured little indie darlings such as SpongeBob SquarePants Battle for Bikini Bottom Rehydrated, an HD update of a game backed by Nickelodeon and published by THQ. Yes, because they need all the exposure they can get. He doesn't care about developers, especially not indies. He only cares about connections, the attention he gets from this perception that he goes up to bat for indies, and putting money in his pocket. The games journalism part will blend a little into the consumer part, and I think it's relevant to point out Nick has a degree in journalism and claims to have worked in games media for 15 years at the age of 29, and he has been a harsh critic of the games press. Meanwhile, he let people air out their controversial opinions and stances without question, effectively giving them a platform. He publicly and internally lashed out at other journalists as a favor to his connections behind the scenes. Passed on unverified information or information he knew was false as a way to attack his opposition and coal favor with his side, so to speak. Here are a few examples where he claims the 15 years. Here's an example from 2024 where Nick talks to me about lazy journalists. And now for the general timeline. During Gamumentary days, in 2018 he published a documentary with a developer who at the time was under fire for controversial posts. Nick elected to only air the developer's side of the story unchallenged because he wanted to preserve his personal connections behind the scenes. While at Escapist, In October 2020, Nick called journalist Jason Schreier toxic, saying if you even try to have a nuanced conversation and he sees it, he takes out all context and puts a fucking target on your back to paint you as a corporate apologist or in support of crunch or whatever. But behind the scenes, Nick was indeed getting involved in the matter as a favor to his personal connections associated with CD Projekt Red at the time. His goal was to be a corporate apologist. Here is an example of Nick attacking journalist Kirk McKeon, who has always been a piece of shit and a fucking coward, who made the whole big stink about the Hogwarts Legacy guy and how he was going to be the next big grifter. I was aware Nick held a long-standing and angry distaste for Kirk since our time at The Escapist, saying he writes smear campaigns and wasn't a credible journalist. What I didn't know at the time was that Nick was trying to smear Kirk for years as a favor to a behind-the-scenes connection that had problems with Kirk and wanted him out of the scene. Kirk didn't even know Nick existed. Remember, in journalism, reputation and credibility are the main occupational requirements. Saying a journalist is dishonest in their reporting is pretty damning. While at SWG, Nick put out unverified information that turned out to be fake because he was running another smear campaign. Nick admitted to me in private that he likes the attention that journalists get when they expose people. He also uses his position to help his people. Here he is saying on July 10th, I just got so tired of seeing community managers getting attacked over nothing and decided to do something about it by trying to discredit that one person. Good news is, I guess lots of people following out of respect and joining up on Patreon. Side note, this is why ethics are important in journalism. If Nick is reporting on someone with false information, then he's attacking an innocent person. But let's say Nick is correct and the person is 1000% evil. Because Nick published fake information, all the evidence is tainted. Who's to say how much of the rest of the information that he's gathered is even real? And it makes it harder for the people doing proper journalism to actually bring the evil to light. If you're a bad faith actor, it helps the bad faith actor. And after he got shamed by the people he claimed to fight for, he went back to hating games journalists. He's swayed by people and his allegiances are to whatever his side might be, not any real morals, values, or politics. Now more to the consumer side. Nick has made or has been in charge of sites that make fan-funded documentaries, write video game reviews, and provide independent press coverage. Journalism and this part of games media is in the business of integrity. That's not me being noble, we sell sincerity. People buy into us for our honesty and transparency. Nick preaches these things and attacks those that he thinks are being dishonest with their critiques and coverage and unethical with their business practices. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Nick traded good press coverage and suppressed criticism for his PR connections in exchange for more connections, money, gear, paid trips, and paid documentary opportunities, which he did not disclose. To clarify, PR stands for public relations. Their job is all about promoting the image of their products. They offer stuff all the time, and that's perfectly fine. It's the reviewers, journalists, and people taking the sponsors that have to disclose the connections or flat out refuse favors that cross ethical boundaries. But remember, there is no one to enforce it. Now for the general timeline and examples. While at Gamumentary, Nick was running a crowdfunder for his documentaries. He did not disclose to the people giving money, though, that one of the involved studios promised to give a minimum of $4,000 to get the crowdfunder across its goal. Shown here is an email from August 2017 that Nick shared with his staff. Nick says, "We also have a potential investor on standby that will put a minimum of $4,000 in if we get close enough to our goal." Nick attached the email from the investor at the top. The name is censored, but you can see the domain name is at outpostgames.com, and they say, "Outpost Games just kicked in $4,000. Hope that's enough to push you over. Excited to work with you all on an incredible doc of SOS." It was enough, as without it the crowdfunder would have been short about $3,000. And given that Nick was crowdsourcing money for 7 documentaries for $22,000, and he stated, "We believe with a few exceptions that our short docs will all have very similar costs associated with them. Then each doc cost about $3,142 to produce, which means someone at Outpost Games effectively paid for their own documentary." Nick's reason for covering Helm Systems was in exchange for a VR headset, also not disclosed. The staff was not happy with Nick's unethical behavior, and it led to some resignations, which is what led to him threatening to ruin one staff member's career. Many of Nick's PR connections were made during this time at Gamumentary. Those people have provided their services for different publishers over the years, and the most notable ones have worked through THQ, THQ Nordic, and Evolve PR. Which you'll notice, they published the Darksiders games, they published Battle Chasers, they acquired Gunfire Games in 2019, they acquired Kingdom Come Deliverance in 2019. Which was the game I mentioned prior where Nick let a developer air his controversial opinions uncontested. It was as a favor to his connection. Here's an example of an email in which someone mentions the Kingdom Come Deliverance board game, and Nick responds, "Maybe a sponsorship opportunity in here. Obviously have good relations with Kingdom Come due to the doc and all that." That's his method. Positive coverage to create rapport and trade for bigger favors later. An example I mentioned before was in 2020, he put THQ Nordic's SpongeBob game in his indie showcase meant for tiny and smaller budget developers. If you don't know about video games, that's like letting a professional heavyweight boxer fight in an amateur lightweight match. Also, while at Escapist, Nick at times used his position as managing editor or editor-in-chief to try and coerce writers into giving better reviews or dampen their negative critiques to stay in the good graces of his connections, predominantly THQ Nordic. He wouldn't do it to everyone, just the smaller freelancers. Here's one example. Nick tried to water down a writer's negative remarks of a THQ-connected game they were reviewing, stating, "This is a bit messy. The general hook was to make a franchise game for the fans of the series first and foremost. I'm not sure I'd focus on this as a central criticism. I'd refocus this to that point, that it offers ideas, but they're just ideas and not expanded on further than that, really." He wanted to change well-articulated complaints and excuse it as a game for fans and downplay it by saying they're just ideas and not expanded on further than that. Quick side note, there is a stigma that games journalists will pad out the score of a game as a favor to developers, publishers, or PR. And people will counter that by saying, who would want to be given a 7 out of 10 score as a favor? 7 out of 10 generally means average, inoffensive, not too bad but not too good. What Nick is doing is trying to get the game out of the 6 out of 10 and lower range where games start to be considered flops. So that's the context in which giving a 7 out of 10 is a favor to a publisher. It's a mercy. And while the 3-minute review format doesn't publicly use review scores, there was an internal system. As you can see, the writer had internally assigned the game a 6 out of 10, and worded the review as a 6 out of 10. Now, I'm not saying that every other games journalist pads out review scores as favors and no one should be trusted. I'm saying Nick Calandra specifically cannot be trusted, and due to his unethical behavior, it taints the sincerity and honesty of anything that's been put out under his tenure as owner of Gamementary, managing editor, and editor-in-chief at Escapist. Biomutant was also brought up as an example of Nick trying to manipulate coverage. This game was also published by THQ Nordic and didn't do all that well. And when I say Nick pushed the writers, I mean he would hold back on promoting their work on the Escapist socials. Doesn't sound like a big deal, but writers live or die on growing a following. Nick would also refuse to publish their work unless they did something for him in return. Freelancers at Escapist Magazine were being paid on the work that was published. You could play the game, write the review, make the video, but if Nick, who had final say, didn't publish your work, then you couldn't invoice and get paid for it. An example here is one writer mentioned, there was also the time Nick finally offered to properly promote my work, but only if I covered Halo topics while he was streaming the Halo games. I stuck it out though because I thought I'd made it, that it'd get better with time. And it's not like Nick outright shouted at me or anything, but he definitely kept subtly showing the door, but couldn't give a good reason because I kept doing just well enough. And whenever I had a win, well, that was all according to plan. And if it was on a game Nick couldn't care less about, see 90% of the games I covered, then I'd get one promo tweet tossed into the void. Multiple writers shared similar experiences. I also had experiences that were in line with that. Nick had me work on multiple projects that didn't get published but kept promising me pay for them anyways. He was also more amicable if I just let him do whatever, but he constantly tried to revise history and claim credit for my work. Even all the way through to Second Wind, where he says we worked together on things like Cold Take and the Stuff of Legends, branding ideas, scripts. It's not just you working on those shows, so keep that in mind. But that is demonstrably not true. Cold Take was my show, and you can see here I made the first episode in 2020, 2 years before it showed up at Escapist. That's why I still own the rights to it after we left Escapist, and why I still own the rights to it today. The noir shtick was something I was doing in 2019, and I know Nick knows this because I showed him all this when I was pitching the show. Marty edited my scripts at Escapist and SWG, Omar made the intro at Escapist, Javid made the intro at SWG. Nick would sometimes greenlight ideas, meaning I'd have to throw him a bunch of ideas until he said okay to one. So I'd end up with forced topical content like The Last of Us or beating the dead horse on a Souls game. The show didn't take off until the numbers dropped enough for him to leave me alone. The inverse was true for the Stuff of Legends. I was already doing strange entertainment history videos like the fake Sony critic in May of 2022, a year before the first Stuff of Legends video. I thought the title was his, but he took that from a different writer. The series was going great at the start when my editor and I were left alone, but Nick kept trying to push his topics. You can see here 200,000 views, 200,000 views, 200,000 views, but he wouldn't greenlight any other topics, so when I finally caved in and used his ideas, the show tanked and we lost all momentum. None of his episodes have been able to break 100,000 views even after all this time, and it started with Carmageddon. It was so bizarre to me at the time because I didn't know why he was so pushy and so insistent on it. After I knew what to look for, I found out THQ Nordic acquired the rights to the Carmageddon series from Stainless Games in December 2018. For my part, he wasn't aggressive or mean-spirited yet. He was able to get away with this behavior with me because I eventually just got tired of dealing with it and let him do whatever. Also, honestly, I felt bad for him. I thought Nick was kind of sad as a person and stress made him act weird. I figured if he could get some kind of a win, he'd calm down. Now, Nick's attacks on Jason Schreier and attempted nuanced defense of Crunch at the CD Projekt Red studio were because of Nick's connections through Evolve PR at the time, who were working alongside Cyberpunk 2077. Nick's attacks on Kirk were at the behest of one Evolve PR connection who held a grudge against Kirk and other journalists. Here you'll see examples of email previews of Twitter messages to Nick from his connection stating, Journalist 1 and Journalist 2, both bitches who will tweet anything for attention. Example 2, no, it was literally Journalist 1 quote tweeting anyone they disagree with like a total bitch. Example 3, lol at fucking Kirk, when's the last time you looked in the mirror? Example 4, it'll be nice when Kirk fucks off, lol, he's almost out of there. I believe Nick being part of the games press and pretending to be a watchdog for the people, for gamers, by calling out lazy journalism, standing up for developers that are mistreated by corporate, and standing against bullying, when he's actually being a corporate lapdog, taking advantage of his own workers and developers and being a bully, all to enrich himself, is in my opinion highly unethical and highly corrupt behavior for the business we're in. Also important to note, because of Nick's overbearingness, multiple writers resigned, but some confess that if Nick pressed them too many times for positive coverage, they would give worse reviews intentionally to spite him. As there were fewer writers at the time, Nick ultimately had to choose between not publishing their work or allowing the biting write-ups to go live. So overall, Nick's attempts to manipulate coverage ended up with reviews that skewed much more positive or negative than what the original writers intended. Either way, he was responsible for dishonest coverage. Now to speak more on how Nick uses positive coverage to angle for more favors, gear, travel, and paid documentary opportunities. Here's an example of an email from June 15, 2022, where Nick is soliciting a paid documentary opportunity and outlines what they provide. For how we do doc projects, since they are paid projects, we give the devs more say over what they want included. We also provide them with all the B-roll we shoot while making the doc for use in any of their own marketing projects later on. If a documentary is paid for by the subject matter, and they have control over what they want included, that needs to be disclosed. Otherwise, this is playing loose with ethics and integrated marketing. To show how out of the ordinary paid documentaries are from press outlets, this here's an example from May 15, 2023, where a PR person is pitching ideas to Nick, and when Nick asks if it's a paid gig, the PR person has to clarify that they were pitching it as a pure editorial opportunity. This is blurring the lines between journalism and marketing. Nick's usually the one initiating these, and often the other person might think on it, but they generally don't accept his quality or price of $30,000 or think it's a bit dodgy. At times, he picks the projects based on the location of the studio for the trips. Here's an example of that from January 30, 2023. The docs we'd love to work on would be Sea of Stars and definitely Dead Island 2, another THQ Nordic association. Flintlock would be out there as well, considering that studio is in New Zealand. Sometimes the PR person pays for travel and it's not disclosed. Other times the parent company covers the costs and that wouldn't have to be disclosed. But keep in mind what I said earlier that he was always promising people raises and promotions, then blaming corporate for poor working conditions. Meanwhile, he was driving up the costs with his own raises and prioritizing his travel. Here's another example, an email from November 30, 2018. Nick's reaching out about Kingdoms of Amular, THQ Nordic again. Nick's pointed to Volition instead for Saints Row, also THQ Nordic. And here's an email from July 8, 2022 with flight confirmations to Las Vegas for a Saints Row event that Nick didn't disclose because he didn't publish any coverage for the event, which some people in this industry might find to be a different degree of unethical. Generally, you are to avoid favors unless it's the only way to get access and coverage, but then you at least have to disclose it. So just taking a favor makes you wonder, why are you even there and what is your relationship with these people? It's the act independently pillar of ethics. Avoid conflicts of interest, real or perceived. Disclose unavoidable conflicts. Now, the biggest example that I'm allowed to show is in relation to EVE Online. Nick sold 2 documentaries to EVE Online. Only one, the FanFest documentary, which was released on EVE Online's channel, was disclosed. In this email from November 3rd, 2021, Nick explicitly states, here's the revised invoice to include the added cost of spending the extra days to film both documentaries. Both. He's bargaining for 2 documentaries in one paid deal. Once approved by you guys, we can get a contract put together and make sure to lock in the dates of May 3rd through the 12th, 2022, for both the FanFest doc and the main doc for next year. So the FanFest documentary was considered supplementary to the main documentary, which ended up being the Making of EVE Online documentary that was not disclosed. Here's an expense reimbursement list for the flights and hotels. Note transportation is paid for by CCP Games, and accommodations are also paid for by CCP Games. Furthermore, he was flown back out to Iceland in 2023 to present the documentary. Here's an email where he extends his stay in Iceland. Here's the stream showing him on the stage. Here's an email reserving a goodie bag with gear worth $161 for his arrival. Here's a screenshot of a press dinner and excursion guest list for the Sky Lagoon. You can see that Nick is the only one from The Escapist on the list. September 27, 2023, Nick received a confirmation email from CCP's PR saying that he would be receiving a Quest 3 VR set. October 17, 2023, Nick confirms in an email that he received the Meta Quest 3. I believe stuff like this is the goal for Nick, but it's not always his reality because not many people do business with him, and fewer do repeat business with him. His prices are way too high and he overpromises on the impact his content will have. So what's more common is Nick would reach out to smaller offers and accept offers simply based on how much they paid without testing the product beforehand, or sometimes testing it, not liking it, but putting in a good word for it anyways. Now, this is where some of the industry's jadedness kicks in, and many will say, oh, everyone does that. That attitude is part of the issue people have that makes it hard for them to trust games media. Gamers, consumers, people in the space, whatever you call them, they want your honesty to help with their purchases. Some gamers are fine if you get paid for your opinion, so long as the connections are disclosed and you're honest, so that they can make their own decisions. The example to show here is Nick took a gaming chair offer for $2,000 and a chair he'd get to keep. Here's an email where the chair company is being assured that the audience would trust Nick. As the EIC and the face of The Escapist, our audience trusts his opinions, and it doesn't feel like we're trying to sell something to the viewers. It will feel earnest. Earnesty, that's a synonym I missed. We're aware that we sell earnesty. This is an email from August 19, 2022, locking in the $2,000 price and chair. Nick did the sponsor and gave it a positive review. Behind the scenes, he not only hated the chair, it injured him, and he swapped it out not too long after. I imagine people would want to know about that. That behavior continued at SWG and only got worse as we found it harder to find more sponsors, so we had to dig deeper. Myself and 2 other SWG members were allowed to vet sponsors at the start. Here's an example of me handing out codes to 4 different individuals stating they're letting us vet the game before accepting the offer, and outlining the plan to test the game's co-op. We didn't like it. Nick didn't ask us to vet any more sponsors after that, and he later approved the one we turned down. As the sponsorship opportunities kept drying up, costs were rising, and revenue was dropping, Nick had no one left to blame or rely on, so he elected to pass the buck on to the audience more and more. Push people to the Patreon, have people donate more money. Personally, I felt Nick was taking no accountability whatsoever and making no effort to reduce costs and reconsider our spending. In my opinion, he was acting entitled and as if he thought he was untouchable. Here's the budget plan he showed us in July of 2024 that was essentially nothing. It's a concept of a plan with a projected cost of $1 million. When I try to get him to see reason or stop him, he'd isolate me. When the head of sales tried to help or stop him, Nick isolated him. Nick also blamed him for all our problems and later got him fired. Our second biggest earner. And why? Because he felt he was being made redundant. Nick was bad at business, but I was willing to work with that until he actively fought against anyone who tried to get him to see reason. It's one thing to not be able to make a plan work. I will never fault anyone for trying. It's another thing entirely to actively get in the way and continue to make things worse to protect your own ego. He claims to stand up for consumers, but his loyalty is to his connections, and he only puts up a semblance of respect to the fans that like him or the group without question and give money. And even then he isn't honest to them, as he only shows them what he thinks will drive sympathy and money. He censors reasonable criticism against him and then makes it seem like he is doing the bidding of the people. He then passes off that echo chamber as what the real fans want. He promises innovative projects but gives them exactly what they had before for free with more sponsors. He shows a revenue report to the public with the goal of scaring them with the cost so that they'll throw more money at the group for fear that the content won't exist anymore, but it would. Here in these second win meeting notes, you can see December 4, 2023. Transparency on the revenue sheet drove Patreon interest as well. That's all he cares about. Meanwhile, I don't even know if the numbers are real. I was a co-owner for 8 months and not once did I see the bank statements, and he was legally obligated to show me. If that's the transparency I got internally, imagine what everyone else gets. I believe Nick takes up populist stances because he knows that's what people want to hear, especially during such a tumultuous time in the games industry. It feeds his ego and his wallet. Meanwhile, he does the exact opposite of what he advertises. In my opinion, he's a demagogue grifter, and his actions behind the scenes give weight to the worst prejudices that get thrown at the honest people in this industry. Standing up to him is dangerous not only because he has connections and is willing to use them, but because calling him out hurts the rest of us. Even now, he hides behind 8 other people who have stepped up to fend off claims against him and continue to platform him. My main complaints are not with them, but they've made themselves known and are public figures, so I feel I can address them publicly. Not a single one of them has refuted any claim with evidence. These are effectively testimonials from a group corroborating itself. Lead and co-owner Yahtzee Croshaw. His are the giant shoulders that Nick primarily stands on, and when push comes to shove, all Yahtzee wants is to be left alone to make his videos, write his books, and develop his games without needing to worry about anything going on in the background and the foreground. He even starts his announcement with, "I've been asked to comment on this." And he has shown that attitude for the past 15 years, even as Escapist magazine was falling apart through Gamergate and Nick takes part in Gamergate 1.5, and his popular associates like Total Biscuit and Stephanie Sterling, who left Escapist magazine, encouraged him to go independent. His fans urged him to go independent. He doesn't wish to be left alone with having to run an operation, and I understand that. Nick provides him that. Yahtzee can sit there and play video games through all the problems.
Yahtzee was talking about in the meeting yesterday, he was doing like trial runs and scoping out what his path would be while we were in our business meeting. Wow, how professional of you, Yachts.
His desire to just get back to norm and his nervous energy is so strong that it was Yahtzee who cut straight to the chase and said Nick should be demoted and his pay reconsidered. While I agreed, I thought it was hasty and just him wanting to get back to his happy place, so I'm not really surprised by his announcement. Lead and co-owner Omar Ahmed says Nick has always been supportive of the creative and career goals of himself and those around them, even when faced with corporate opposition. I don't know if Omar is aware that Nick tried to lay someone else off to advance Omar from a part-time editor to full-timer. He may not be aware that Nick's preferential treatment of him has come at the cost of others. He also states, quote, "As someone who went on all of those documentary trips, I can attest that none of them were paid for by the game companies aside from the Eve shoot, which we were explicit about." I don't know if Omar is aware that saying he personally went on the documentary trips validates nothing. Being on the same bus, airplane, and hotel rooms doesn't mean you are privy to the business emails, which I have seen, and I didn't see Omar in any of them. Omar also asserts only the Eve shoot was paid for and it was explicitly stated. If you recall from the Eve Online breakdown, 2 documentaries were shot and only 1 was disclosed. This also contradicts Nick, who said that the PR for Sea of Stars paid for the flights for the documentary, which wasn't disclosed. Sounds like even Omar doesn't know what he knows. I'm also showing a tweet from Omar sent out on April 9th, 2018. The context here is that Omar used to work at Channel Awesome, a collaborative YouTube channel that publicly went through a series of scandals where dozens of affiliated creators left after making claims of a history of poor management, verbal abuse and bullying, sexual harassment and misconduct. This happened in 2014 and 2015. This happened again on April 2, 2018. Omar sought work with Channel Awesome while the first series of scandals were being aired publicly and dozens of people were leaving, and when he did leave with about 30 other members during the second wave on April 9th, 2018, Omar had this to say. "After days upon days of reading everything that's been going on, leaving just felt like the right thing to do. I'm not going to give any juicy stories though, because honestly I have none. All of my interactions with 2 people the claims were being levied against, and the rest have been pleasant and professional. They were all accommodating and understanding of whatever I needed, and personally I harbor no ill will toward any of them. I'd even call it a pleasure working with them when I had the chance. But of course my experiences don't negate those of the other producers." I believe his old testimonial is relevant with this testimonial and show that Omar has a history and a pattern of not being as clued in as he thinks he is. The 2018 document alone had written allegations from over 22 people and somehow Omar noticed nothing. This is in line with what I experienced working alongside him. He's not informed on a lot and lets Nick fill in the gaps. Ask Omar what he thinks and he'll probably start the sentence with, "Well, Nick said." Leader and co-owner Marty claims he never once felt pressured to sway his editorial coverage of a game positively or negatively for outside reasons and never once heard of that from anyone else. The slightest whiff of anything like that would have raised a shitstorm from himself and the rest of the crew. Never once felt pressured to sway editorial coverage is an interesting choice of words that is relevant. It's like asking someone if they ever took a bribe and instead of saying, "No, I was never bribed," they say, "It didn't feel like a bribe." That is relevant to a small issue found in the games press. When you work in this industry, you get used to the perks, so it might not feel like a bribe. Being flown out for a few days to report on a game may not feel like a bribe. Getting early access coverage may not feel like a bribe. Conducting interviews with the people who made your favorite games may not feel like a bribe. It might feel like work and you'd much rather be at home in bed. Regardless of being swayed one way or another, it is a conflict of interest. It might even swing the other way. Maybe you felt coerced to travel and you were annoyed and that feeling made its way into your coverage. These are the biases that we're not always aware of, and more importantly, regardless of how you felt, gamers and consumers will definitely perceive it as a conflict of interest and question your ethics if you didn't disclose it and they find out. Marty knows he should avoid situations like this one where he's talking to the PR for Sea of Stars and fielding questions for the documentary, then reviewing the game when it's released. Marty can feel like the experience didn't sway him, but how does that look to an outsider? If they knew that he had a back and forth with the person in charge of promoting the best image for the game, who paid for their outlet's flights to make a documentary, and then he later reviewed the game. And I do know Marty lets his coverage be swayed if it means minimizing work stress. Take the path of least resistance, clock in, clock out, speak up if things get bad, but if nothing changes, then learn to work through it. As I mentioned before, at times Nick takes sponsors for products no one liked, and this would put Marty in the awkward position of lying to deliver on the already signed contract. I know this because internally I was offered the last Oracrew sponsorship first, and I turned it down because I didn't like it. Marty also didn't like it, but he had to fulfill the already signed contract, and I was assigned to be his editor. Since Marty had nothing good to say about the game, he wrote around it and talked about his nostalgia for co-op games. The sponsor didn't like that he hardly mentioned the game. Marty added a bit where he played with a friend and the script was reformatted until the sponsor was satisfied. I was new to the industry and didn't really know what was going on, but I felt if I was the consumer there and I knew what had happened, I would have felt lied to, so I asked Marty what he thought about the ordeal. And he said it was just one of those things you get used to. It would raise a fuss every now and again to Nick, but then nothing would change, and the same happened at SWG. Marty did mention baggage, and I believe that's a relevant note in his testimonial because Marty has very heavy baggage that I believe spilled over into SWG when he voted to fire the head of sales. Marty did something unsavory in 2018 while he was working at one of the biggest outlets in the scene, IGN, which has made it difficult for him to find employment in the industry. I'm not at liberty to disclose what he did, but I will provide context to his status afterwards with this interview from November 9th, 2022, where Nick talks about hiring Marty in spite of him being seemingly unwelcome in the industry. The reason this is relevant is because Marty had a history with Cisco, our head of sales. They worked together at IGN, and Cisco was there when Marty's thing happened. While at SWG, Marty voted to fire Cisco because he was upset that Cisco wasn't doing more than a normal head of sales job while being underpaid. That made no sense to me, and when I asked him to clarify, he waffled on it. His salary was low for his role, and he wasn't allowed to earn commission. If you don't understand what that means, go find someone who works in sales, tell them this, wait for their reaction, and then ask them to explain. This is a video from that meeting where the leads informed us they fired Cisco and that conversation happened. And then after my resignation, Nick and Casey informed me that Marty had retracted his complaints, and they told me that Marty said he didn't know Cisco, only knew of him. But I did vet their connections and they did work together in close proximity. They were essentially friends and hung out both during and after work hours. It seemed to me like Marty lied about Cisco and voted to fire him to distance himself from his past, whatever it took to minimize his stress in the workplace. Lead and co-owner Jack Packard. For some of these, I will be using clips of a meeting Nick, Casey, and I had after I resigned. The first thing Jack tried to clear up was an apparent misunderstanding between the two of us when Jack said we'd be fine without Yahtzee. He says that he thought he was responding to a hypothetical situation. The thing about Jack is that he knows this isn't true because he will sit there and ask you repeatedly to explain things, in his words, dumb it down to make sure you're on the same page. And I was also so taken aback by his response that I rephrased it multiple times and he repeated his stance. I showed him charts and brought it up in front of the others and he didn't try to correct it. In my opinion, he's only saying it's a misunderstanding now because of the public reaction. He probably still doesn't understand the flaw in his logic. And I don't need to take a statement out of context to prove his lack of judgment. He does it himself, as he was undoubtedly the second worst person to work with at SWG, and that's only because Nick was actively being malicious and sabotaging people. Jack, for all his talent everywhere else, struggles with nuance and reasoning to the point where you can just read it in his statement plain as day. He says he has issues with me distancing myself from any decision as if I was not an owner and had no say in how we operated. Seems he doesn't understand that as far as voting goes with 13 owners, everyone had the same amount of sway in a group vote, meaning any one of us could also be outvoted by a majority, so yes, it is very much possible that someone's decisions were not being represented within the group. That's simple voting protocol, but he also lacks the awareness that he is one of 5 leads who have more say than the other 8 owners. It's even in the bylaws, and he used that position not but a few days prior to fire the head of sales without the 8 others having a say. Essentially, any other person in that situation would have been vulnerable to where 3 can convince 5, and then the 5 can just tell the rest, this is how it goes. There wasn't, like, in that, the team didn't get to talk to Cisco, didn't get to hear him out. He also was an owner.
But that's the way our business is set up through the bylaws. That's the leads and the board decision to make those choices.
Right.
But I will agree that it took me by surprise, and like I was
and that's something we probably need to change. Like, you know, we're all owners.
The way that was done was not probably the best way to have done that.
Well, we follow Jack's direction on that one. I'm going to put my hands up on that.
He also says, I was part of the formation of the business from the start and part of 2 weekly staff meetings and a monthly owners meeting. My claims that Nick isolated staff are demonstrably false in that alone. I don't know if Jack knows what demonstrably means, as he hasn't demonstrated anything beyond a written message, which again is a testimonial and not evidence of anything. But here's another message where Jack addressed the community on August 3rd, 2 days after the head of sales was fired, I resigned, and another member resigned independent of each other, where he states, choosing when to bring decisions to the larger group is up to the individual staff members or the leads as they deem necessary, and that's why we have meetings, spaces to share what we're working on and bring up any issues or concerns. Weekly leads meet, which Jack did not mention. Those were meetings where only he, Yahtzee, Nick, Omar, and Marty met to make decisions. I don't know how often those happened, but I got the sense that it was a common occurrence throughout the week from how often they brought it up. Weekly staff meet, Jack mentioned this one. That's all hands on deck on a Monday. Lasted maybe an hour because Jack didn't like being in meetings too long. Weekly sales meet, Jack didn't mention this one. I was never in these, so I have no idea who was in those meets or how frequently. It also sounded like a common occurrence. I was given access a few days before I resigned, but I was never in one. I didn't know how we picked sponsors or what we were charging, completely in the dark. Weekly video editors meet. Jack didn't mention this one. I was never in these either. From what I understand, these are for the editors that collaborate on projects, predominantly Adventure is Nigh. Cole takes a solo project, and when I was working on Chronicles, I talked to the artist and editor directly, messaged them in the dedicated channel, or left notes and audio directions in Google Docs. I don't know who was in those meetings or how frequently. Weekly CCC creative meeting. Jack kind of mentioned this one. I believe this is the second staff meeting he was referring to. It's not really a mandatory staff meeting so much as a voluntary quick creative check-in that had maybe 4 or 5 of us on average. Lasted about an hour and Jack wasn't in those much. Monthly owners meets. Now Jack did mention these. The reason these are called owners meets, not staff meets like the others, are because Casey, Jesse, and the head of sales were excluded from these as they weren't owners until June or so. These sometimes happened more than monthly as we had to have important emergency meetings from time to time. And those 3 were isolated out of them. So Jack explicitly stated 6 meetings and then walked back 3 of them. Conveniently, the 3 he left out were the ones I didn't have access to and happened on a more routine basis. From the meetings I was in, it wasn't more than the leads informing us of the decisions they made in the leads meetings for about 15 to 30 minutes, and then everyone went around in a circle to say what they were doing that week. If I brought up a pressing matter, it would be kicked to a later meeting because the team, especially Jack, didn't like being in meetings for longer than an hour, or Nick would tell me to meet with him separately, which didn't happen, or he'd tell me to stay in my lane. Our meeting logs are demonstrable proof of how sloppy we were. It's been about 38 weeks since SWG started, and we've logged in 20 mandatory meetings. If we're to go by Jack's logic that there were 2 weekly meetings, then the number should have been closer to 76 meetings, 84 if you add the 8 monthly meetings we should have had. I might be off a little bit there, but we only logged 20, and of those 20, Jack missed 6 of them, giving him the worst participation rate of the 5 leads. I am 100% sure, though, that we had more than 20 meetings, but we didn't have nearly as many as Jack is alluding to. Furthermore, he admits to making more meetings because people didn't think they were being heard. Recently, we've initiated monthly individual vibe checks with all the full-time staff to make sure that any concerns are being heard. A complaint that we heard was that there were some staff members who felt their ideas were not being given due consideration or that they were feeling bottlenecked. A lot of decisions were going through Nick and only Nick. The feedback we received about our decision-making process has caused us to open a lot of doors we didn't know were closed or even there. Now we have an official HR department, Jack, whose job it is to organize meetings, write notes, and follow up with proposals and concerns. We had plenty of meetings, but we made more. There was no isolation, there was bottlenecking, and Nick was making all the decisions, and there were doors that we didn't know were there. Jack just says things, and an interesting side note here. He had already assigned himself the role of HR at the end of January because Nick was having problems with another staff member and I had to mediate between the two. Jack just stopped doing the role without notice like a month later. A common issue with Jack where he takes on roles out of the blue, doesn't do them, things get stressful from trying to pick up his slack, and then he comes in and he acts like he's the adult to take on the role out of the blue again and end up not doing it on a cycle.
The tension was rising very quickly.
Yes.
And I was trying to manage that because everybody's like, oh my God, we got to get our views up. And Jack's like, we got to get new eyeballs on our stuff. Get shorts going. There was no thinking behind it. It was just do. And that is how we burn everybody out and get everybody stressed out and freaked out. Like we didn't have a social meeting with the people that wanted to be involved with it. No. And it was just on me to work with Eric to create ideas. And Jack's like, well, we got to have one out I want one out by Monday. And I'm like, this is like gamers all over again. You're just telling me to get something out without any thought put into it. And I don't like that. I don't like that wastes people's, as you said, when you get an idea that we don't want to waste people's time or money here. And so like, if we're not going to sit and think through these things, that frustrates me when that kind of talk happens, when it's just like, just do it to get it done so we can say we did it, which was Jack pushing that on me.
Jack doesn't know CTR from CPR.
Exactly.
And I'm having
I don't either.
And I'm having sure.
And so like a stats meeting was like that.
We're trying to.
Let me run through.
Sorry, a stats meeting for that kind of in-depth look is going to go over everybody's head that does not look at analytics like you and I do. But like when we're in a meeting and it's half the time you just have to explain to Jack or somebody else how these things work, like nobody's going to get it. Everybody's going to get frustrated. I had to keep adding more and more to my plate. Jack putting payroll back on me, and I had to manage all that stuff. And then, Jack saying, well, let's get meetings set up with the freelancers. And it's like, okay, now I have to find time to do that. And then I'm helping with sales, and then I'm helping with Patreon and all this stuff. It just, things fell through the cracks because not enough got delegated, and people would say they were going to do things and then offload it. And Jack was a big part of that. Jack didn't want to be in all the channels. He made that very clear. And then he went to do Adventures Nigh, but then he was doing payroll, then he had his divorce, and then he threw that back onto me. And so now, like, I did become a bottleneck because, like, things just weren't be shifting around. Like, Omar held production, right? But, he's not doing anything on the business side, really. And then, like, Jack and Omar, or Jack or whoever was, like, I want to say in merch. And then they wouldn't post any ideas or do anything in merch, so it came down to me again. We've been consistent on Second Wind. I don't think there's any doubt about that. We've had our dip because it's the summer, and again, like our views dipped. Yahtzee didn't want to cover the biggest games. We're gonna have a dip because of that. We don't cover a lot of very like topical games and things right now. We do a lot of evergreen content. That's okay. But one of the things that was driving me absolutely nuts was Jack coming to me and telling me, like, we're resting on our laurels, we're resting on our laurels, and we got to do better, we got to get our views up. And that just felt pressure. Like, everything else was going on. And then all that pressure when Jack gets stressed, my experience with him is he doesn't want to actually do things. And like, personally, like, and I'm happy to bring it up if people want me to, but like, I feel like we should have a vote on who we decide as HR, because like, Casey, you've done a fucking great job managing this, and I would vote for you to be HR over Jack. There's that should be.
And I think that's fair. Yeah, because those decisions were kind of made. As a full-time person and as an owner, those sorts of decisions do feel like they're made elsewhere.
Yeah, and like that's just Jack putting himself in that role, and like that's. I don't personally agree with Jack being in HR because I have not felt heard by Jack when I brought issues up. And he kind of writes him off as like just me taking things personally. I'm like, well, I mean, that's not helpful. He like assumed the role of HR and then he didn't really do it.
Okay.
Right? Yeah, it's the same thing with payroll where he got stressed and then he didn't want to do it.
Yeah, because when I brought
Matt and I have had the same conversations about like Adventures Nigh. Like, why is it taking so long? What has Jack been doing this whole time? Like, why isn't season 4 even started yet? And we filmed it 5 months ago. There's I think we have a lot of systemic issues to solve. I don't know if Jack is the one to solve them. I don't know if he has the organizational skills to do it.
Well, I mean,
he might, but he's kind of asserting them. It wasn't getting done regardless, right? Because it's all up until now. It's been kind of my job to do all that stuff.
Well, I think part of that problem is, no single person is probably going to be the solution. And like,
no.
Yeah, other folks who want to be a part of these solutions
need to step up.
Yeah. Rather than they need to step up, like that's partially true. They also need to be kind of given the opportunity because a lot of times these things are decided before any of us get in the room.
Well, part of me thinks he's dense, part of me also thinks he's dishonest, or at the very least callous and unsympathetic to others' problems because he was in the ivory tower and nothing bad was happening to him. What can also be demonstrably proven beyond words is this email I got on July 23rd, 2024, finally inviting me to view the YouTube analytics I asked Nick and Jack to give me access to multiple times since SWG's inception. I, a co-owner and the second biggest YouTube creator on the channel, had access to my own analytics for a total of 9 days before I left. I asked for an updated thumbnail for the review-style videos I started in January. The group approved it and even had our graphic designer cook me up a really nice one, but Nick refused to use it and kept isolating me from the conversation for 2 months. Here's Discord messages from March 4, where I get Will to change it out for me since he had access to put captions on videos. Here's a tweet from March 11th showing the thumbnail was put on videos, and I'm sure plenty of viewers can attest that some of the review videos had this thumbnail style. Here's a message from March 18th, 2024, where Nick says he's going to swap my thumbnails back to what he wanted, under the guise of testing them, which we didn't have, and then he swapped them all back. Jack makes it seem like I held in all my concerns and threw a tantrum out of nowhere, then when they gave me what I wanted, I was ungrateful. When we finally heard from Frost that he wanted to try things with cold take credits and thumbnails, we made it happen. July 22 was the first time I had full creative freedom. And the reason they gave me control back was because revenue kept dropping. They were losing faith in Nick and I was showing results.
You know, a lot of the meetings you didn't see, and probably why I've been frustrated is because like Jack's telling me one thing, you're telling me another thing. I'm trying to do my thing. We didn't have meetings together to figure out where that all works, right? And you proved with the CTR, right, that was better. And I'm like, yeah, fuck, let's go for it. I want that graph to go up like the rest of you.
In short, Jack is incredibly out of touch with the entire operation, which he admitted, and the reason he stepped up to be a lead was because he didn't want to not have power. As for the testimonials of the other co-owners, Jesse Schwab says a lot of the complaints regarding Nick or Second Wind's management, unless shown evidence proving otherwise, are contradicted by various hearsay between management, creatives, and employees thereof. I did show evidence, and hearsay is defined as information received from other people that one cannot adequately substantiate. So he's saying that I am wrong about Nick and the group because of rumors within the group. I don't think that's the word or phrasing he meant to use, but thank you for your input. James Reed says he had complete autonomy over his creative decisions and Nick never told him what to do in regards to Design Delve for 4 years. Yet I did find an email where Nick is talking to the Sea of Stars PR about the documentary with the paid flights and mentions that they've got the Design Delve to work on soon too. So we'll make sure to keep you in the loop on that one. From working with him, he is prone to being carried away emotionally, and easily swayed if it means it'll make his show more popular. Here's a clip from my talk with Nick and Casey after I resigned, in which Nick expresses the same sentiment.
Jay gets super hyper focused on his views, and his content suffers for it.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And then he overscopes because he thinks he has to do something bombastic to get the views in. It's like, no, I had asked him for months to simplify his thumbnails, and he never did it. I asked him, I said, these are great pieces of art, but on mobile, I can't tell what's going on in this thumbnail. There's nothing there. And he wanted to keep doing the art, right? And so Cisco brings in the idea, and then Jay's like, oh, well, now I got to change the thumbnail.
I did my due diligence and went to James to hear his side of the story. He said, I really don't want to get involved in any of this any more than I already am. He mentioned Nick pushed topics on him, but James believed it would get him more views, and when they didn't get more views, that would upset James, so he'd roast the next game that Nick recommended like he did with Dragon's Dogma. He said he was just looking out for his show and his career, he was amicable in the call, and we left on good terms. Then he goes and publicly says he believes I'm trying to perpetuate an evil Nick narrative. That turn on the dime feels insincere, and it makes me question what he's told me. I believe he's looking out for his show and his career in a rather angry way, which he was prone to doing within the group. December 13, 2023, this was the meeting in which James aired that he felt he should be making more than KC and Jesse because James was the third biggest content creator, or that James should be working less if their pay was going to be so close to his. In these screenshots, I go to James to ask him if he was aware that KC was going to keep his full-time job at Ubisoft. My complaint wasn't how much money Casey was making, but the fact that he lied to us and said he was quitting his job in February. James was more concerned that he was only making so much more than Casey and Jesse. Speaking of Jesse Galena, nice person but hate to say it, internally they're seen as the horse that can be led to water and won't drink. I tried to help them with employment while the Escapist was imploding because they have a hard time finding work. Here's a screenshot where I sent them a link to a game outlet that was hiring and they just tweeted, "Count me interested." I don't see a listed on the careers section of your website. How should folks apply? When all they had to do was click the link, read, and when directed, click the big red font that said, "To apply, fill out this convenient form." I wouldn't doubt that they lost that job before they even applied. On November 7, 2023, I reached out to Nick because I felt he was dangling a job carrot over them and said, "Are the non-core members aware that there is no guarantee of pay for a while? Just making sure because there's a lot of people and one member cited shit pay as reason for leaving gamers among other things." Nick responded, "Yes, they know, they're just here to support and be along for the ride." I know Jesse had gripes with Nick from back at the Escapist because Nick kept getting raises and promotions and giving other people opportunities while Jesse was there for a long time and working for awful wages. I know they had an idea for the 3-minute reviewers to strike for better pay. I was pretty sure Nick had not told Jesse and Casey the truth, so I wasn't surprised when they strong-armed the team by refusing to continue in Adventurers Night unless they were signed on as full-timers. just as I'm not surprised now that they'd speak out to save their only employment. As for KC, he strong-armed the team at the start of the year and lied to us, saying he wouldn't work at SWG unless we paid him enough to leave his full-time job at Ubisoft, and he wouldn't continue Adventurers 9 unless he was full-time at SWG. And then he kept the Ubisoft job because he felt he was owed it. That's how he justifies a lot of his actions. He doesn't care who's in the right or who's in the wrong, so long as he's in the right and he doesn't look bad. While this was initially my problem with Nick's actions, KC made it about himself, because he refuses to believe that someone like Nick could take advantage of him, because KC believes himself superior. But we're all aware that he holds a grudge from the time Marty was promoted to full-time ahead of KC, and he had to strong-arm his way onto the team, so I don't know how he thinks he hasn't been taken advantage of. Before all of this came to a head, KC had said Nick was the problem and was dragging the rest of the team into it. This clip was from April 3rd, 2024, 2 days after I resigned. To the other thing, my main concern is he's being reckless with the livelihoods of everybody else.
Right.
Like, these people, their passion and whatnot, they want to keep working in this industry. It doesn't look good to take any side. The most valuable thing for a lot of y'all right now is your silence.
Right.
And I respect that.
And Nick speaking out.
Yeah.
And like he usually does, and acting as if he's the voice of the team.
Yeah.
Is basically putting all of us in that beef when most of us are not.
Yeah, exactly.
And I 100% agree with that.
But KC was dead set on keeping Nick, saying he doesn't care if what I have to say ends up being true because it didn't happen to him. I said that wasn't a reason to let it go, so KC was upset about how it would make him look. I set out my goals clearly to him on August 10, and he responded, "Please consider just deading all of this and the relationships can be salvaged. You won't have to deal with Nick, can run your solo channel how you wish, and still collaborate with anyone else on the team you want." Calling out Nick externally directly puts SWG in the crosshairs if we don't agree with you, which you are largely aware that we don't. This hinges on the idea that we either don't know something or that we are too blind to see something, and both of these assertions paint all of us negatively. In my opinion, KC lacks intellectual honesty, which is when you know that you're in the wrong, and you admit that you're in the wrong even if it might make you look bad. He says I'm painting things inaccurately in the same written breath where he claims we talked for 2 6-hour sessions even though you can clearly denote that it was 3 hours and 5 hours. It seems like a nitpick, but if you can't even keep the small, easy-to-check things straight, then why should a testimonial with no evidence hold any weight when it comes to the bigger picture? That's why these 9 circled the wagons together. Whether they're malicious, insincere, jaded, apathetic, scared, or even clueless, they have to protect their image. Because the fact is, they've been together for 3, 4, or even 5+ years, and this is potentially their last chance in the games industry. Yahtzee would be fine so long as he hired someone to handle the mundane task. Jack would go back to freelancing, I suppose. Nick was going to quit games media, try to get into PR. Or he can't work anywhere else because of his thing. And the rest worked at Escapist alongside a long-standing game review titan and didn't make anything of themselves that would get them hired anywhere else and let them go independent. SWG was the biggest 8-month chance any creative could ever ask for. No corporate overlord. Funding of over $800,000, most of that fan funding. They've already spent over $500,000. They have a longtime industry veteran as a tentpole creator by their side, on a channel with over 400,000 subscribers. And these creatives came up with what? The same stuff they made at the other outlets that they complained was holding them back from crazy and innovative ideas. Except now the fans have to pay for it, and the free viewing experience is even worse because you refuse to reevaluate your costs because you feel entitled to the money and you think you're owed the attention. There's massive chips on SWG's shoulders, and there's no one left to blame like you used to. You can't blame corporate, Google, the YouTube algorithm, the zero punctuation audience, other co-workers. You only have yourselves now. And they choose to go along and platform the guy who got them fired from the Escapist. The story was everyone resigned in solidarity, but really Nick got himself and most of everyone fired. The only people of the core group that resigned were myself, Yahtzee, Omar, and Marty. The rest came along because they had no jobs. But when I tried to help, I was gaslit and isolated, start to finish. Here's a message from November 2, 2023. The parent company was trying to fire Nick and give me his job. I warned him and also tried to convince Nick's bosses to demote him instead of throw him away. I stood up for him then because he fed me lies that it was corporate's fault, and ultimately, I liked the rest of the group, and they trusted him. Let's jump on a call with me, you, and Omar to figure out this plan of demoting me. Let's go ahead and have you accept my job and I'll go back to EIC. When you tell them I'll go back to just being EIC, tell them I also want to be involved in editorial again as the true EIC. Doing video and editorial should make sure they leave my salary alone. Then July 15, 2024, when we were at the worst of it, when I was trying to convince the team to see reason about cost and figuring out a new game plan, Nick kept getting in the way, pulling rank and overruling me by saying he had more experience than me. I told him his logic was farcical and the better ideas should win out, but if he wanted to use that logic, then he needed to remember that in spite of all of his experience, he was fired and his job was offered to me. He messaged me, "He did not offer you my job." That's what's wrong with games media. Demagogue grifters like Nick say anything they want. They say they're looking out for developers, workers, journalists, consumers, and then he takes advantage of them. He pushes away anyone that can hold him accountable and uses people who can't or won't stand up to him as a shield. That's why I stepped away from SWG. And SWG itself is a small petri dish representing the wider problem at large. How can anyone stand up for what's right if their livelihood depends on them looking away? How can anyone point out corruption when doing so validates the stigmas that surround your occupation? How can anyone have a discussion over the roar of a culture war? This whole situation is such a mess, I have to lay out an entire history of the press leading through to the modern age and skirting politics just to properly frame the problem. I have to educate people before they can care. And to get to my position, where I can walk away from a stable salary, call out a group that's become synonymous with independent change in the industry, and have people flock to support me is nothing short of a blessing. And I think walking away from it would be a slap in the face of the people that put me here. I'm speaking out because I do believe in populist values. I want to help developers, workers, journalists, and consumers in the space. You can call me noble, but really I'm a scoundrel who's only in it for himself. If I help clean up the industry, then there's better conditions for better developers to make better games for me. There's better consumers to keep corporations from dangling unfinished low-quality live service carrots. And there's a better press to keep things clean so I don't have to. I don't sit atop a high horse whining about not maintaining high standards. I'm a rascal with his boots on the ground asking for the bare minimum and trying to avoid hitting rock bottom. But oh, you got plenty of professionals. Maybe a rascal is what this industry needs. I want to continue as an independent, and I wish to continue raking the muck until I'm no longer necessary. During my investigation, I was pointed at other people in this industry that operate like Nick and hold a lot more influence. And I want to focus my attention on those people. It's a lot of downtime in investigative work as you wait for sources to flesh out. And I want to spend that downtime lifting others up because there is such a thing as having your head in too much muck. As Theodore Roosevelt warned the investigative journalists in 1906, you may recall the description of the man with the muck rake. The man who could look no way but downward with the muck rake in his hands, who was offered a celestial crown for his muck rake, but who would neither look up nor regard the crown he was offered, but continued to rake to himself the filth of the floor. I don't want to rake for the sake of raking, but to give room for others to catch a break. So in the downtime, I plan to continue streaming and making videos that spotlight the good people and encourage better practices in the industry. I'd like to thank all of those that have supported me and continue to support me. If you wish to support directly, then I've opened up a Ko-Fi and a Patreon. If I want to continue doing this independently, and I do, I can't be shy about money because the people I'm after aren't shy about it either. And I think I can put it to better use. All I ask is that your needs are met first before you give to me. Raking out the problems and raising up the solutions, that's how we change this industry.